Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good to see you. I'm excited to talk today about social media, and your relationship to it, both personally and intellectually.
Oh, such a big question.
Indeed. You are obviously a scholar and now filmmaker. So for those who might not be familiar with your work, and the many brilliant ideas that you've put out into the world, can you tell me how you have developed your interest and practice in the power of media to shape representation?
Yes. So I can say I came at media in a roundabout way. I was pre-med in undergrad, and really the early part of my life, I really thought I was going to be a medical doctor. And then I started to think about race representation in medicine, and some formative experiences had me thinking through how media informs how doctors see patients. And so that shifted my focus a bit. And I went to grad school instead of medical school and started doing a project looking at representation in the media that young future physicians make for themselves. And I was looking at this moment in the 1910s, right after the Flexner Report is published. And Flexner Report is this report created by this guy, Abraham Flexner, that went to all the medical schools in the United States and Canada and basically was telling them what they should and should not be doing in terms of their medical education. And it totally transformed a lot of medical schools. A lot of schools closed, including some Black medical schools. It had a real impact on how medicine was practiced. And in that process, medical students were trying to make sense of themselves and their future patients. And in that making sense process, they were creating a lot of media. And the media that they created really relied on a lot of stereotypes. So I was surprised to see some representations of Black women in these 1910 yearbooks, medical school yearbooks created by students at Emory School of Medicine. And so this is the segregated South. So it was kind of interesting to see Black women there because they weren't generally the patient population that these future physicians would be working with. And they also weren't allowed to attend medical school, but they were the perfect foil to this white male student body in the medical school. So this juxtaposition of Black women and white male doctors really became kind of a crucial thing that I was noticing. And it really got me thinking about social media in a different way. So I think of yearbooks as a precursor for things that we enjoy now, like Facebook. And all of these things have this work that they're doing outside of a very standard curriculum that you might see in a textbook. A lot is happening in the media that students are making for themselves.
Yeah, indeed. And we're going to talk about the tensions therein for the rest of this time. But before we even get to that, how did you personally get introduced to social media, and when did you realize that that was a powerful tool?
Oh, so I'm an early adopter. I am from what they call the Oregon Trail generation. So I grew up playing Oregon Trail on the computer at school, um, was in AOL chat rooms I had no business being in when I was a young person. And so social media was early and a thing that I was connected to very early on. And even when I was in high school, I had friends who were figuring out how to make their own web pages, and we were using HTML when we were getting to college to keep in touch and think about the people who are in our lives. So that was one thing. And then, some of those early social media platforms invited you to do your own tinkering. So MySpace, I think for a lot of people, was an early introduction into some light coding and, making your page look a certain way. So, yeah, social media was something that I definitely thought of as more for fun. And then as I got into graduate school and as graduate school was winding down, digital humanities started to emerge as a real field. And so a lot of the things that I was doing socially and in organizing spaces, using social media as a tool for organizing in the rest of the world, I could now see its utility in my academic work. And so thinking about social media became a really important part of what I was doing intellectually after that.
Yeah, and I love how you started 100 years ago, because in some ways you're talking about the fact that media has always been social, right? But there is now this thing called social media where its primary purpose is social. And so I'm wondering in your research and then also in your practice, what were those moments where you really saw social media's ability to organize the social, especially in ways that were meaningful to those people?
Yeah. So we share a love for a conference that no longer exists, Allied Media Conference. And in some of those early days of AMC, before there was Twitter, there was SMS, texting to texting to the internet. So you could send a text and it could go to a certain URL and you could see it real time. And so at one of the first Allied Media conferences that I attended in Detroit, during the opening ceremony, we were texting live and it was showing up on screen. And there was just a scrolling um, list of texts from people in the audience. And that was like the coolest thing. Like everybody was blown away because this is, again, before Twitter was even a thought. And so we were kind of those early adopters in some ways of seeing social media as a tool. And while I was at Northeastern in Boston, my first academic job out of graduate school, I met some folks in communication studies. So Sarah Jackson and Brooke Foucault Wells. And they were already thinking about social media in a couple of contexts, how people were using it in Ferguson and how people had created hashtags that were really helpful in getting conversations going. And simultaneously, I was looking at Janet Mock's hashtag Girls Like Us and how trans women, particularly trans women of color, Black trans women, were organizing online using Twitter to have conversations and make connections that otherwise would have been really hard to make. And so those connections, we were seeing how hashtags were helpful and what people were able to do and how people were able to move. And so we started on a course of writing a book, hashtag activism, and that really became one of the ways that we documented some of those early ways that we saw social media being used for movement work and for organizing.
Yeah, I really love those analyses of how hashtags became these technologies for connecting people across localities, um, and sharing information, and also, especially with girls like us, like showing care, right? And like really building people up. Um, and it does feel like that is far away now. It feels like a kind of moment when I think people thought maybe this was going to be the thing. Is that your understanding that that was a moment in time? And if so, what was special about that moment? And then we'll get to maybe how we got off course if you agree.
Yeah. When on book tour for my book, A Misogynoir Transformed, I had a conversation with Miriam Kaba, also another person with a Northwestern connection and longtime attendee and presenter at Allied Media Conference as well. And Miriam Kaba was saying that we used to be peers on these apps and that things really shifted once we got influencer culture and followers. And I really think that that's an astute reading. We were peers. There was a sense that all of us online were talking with each other, not to each other. And so there was much more back and forth, and people were willing to have conversations. And I think this is also a carryover from the earlier stages of blogging before microblogging and tweeting. People had blogs and people wrote daily, weekly, and people read each other's blogs. And people were in web rings where people talked to each other across these platforms. And there wasn't a sense that somebody knew more than somebody else. It was a conversation that people were having with each other, with peers. And I really think that that has changed how we relate. There's a way that someone with a lot of followers is considered an influencer and has this sense that they're over the people who are following them. This is not an equal exchange. And so I think that has really shifted how people interact with social media. I'd say also the platforms themselves have shifted where interaction is not quite like it used to be. So platforms like TikTok and Instagram don't really allow for the same kinds of conversations. You're putting out your media, other people are ingesting it, consuming it, but it isn't the same as a platform like Tumblr where there's an expectation of a back and forth.
Yeah, I think you're talking about how social media started as the response or antidote to traditional legacy broadcasting of the 20th century. And we've kind of, because maybe of the capitalist impulse, like gone back to a different kind of broadcasting. And
Absolutely.
before we get to this moment we're in, I do want to, because you're one of the few scholars who actually cares about web series, I do want to talk about web series as social media.
Yes.
Um, because it sounds when I read your reading of web series, you talk about these kind of short form independent TV shows, largely on YouTube, as a form of kind of cultural conversation and a way that communities work through things, as opposed to just trying to blast out their stories and ideas, which is like kind of what YouTube has become as well, like very influencery, right? Like very like vlogger, talking head. This is what I think energy. So yeah, can you talk about web series as social media?
Yes. Yes. I love a web series. And I think there was a moment where web series were very clearly made by people who cared about the content and they mostly wanted to see themselves. It wasn't about monetizing, it wasn't about, creating something that people thought was going to launch them into a career as an actor. These were mostly projects made of love and people wanting to see themselves. So, one of the earliest ones I'm thinking of is Lovers and Friends. And it was, the production values were rough. None of these people were actors. I think very few of them, if any of them, went on to become actors. It seemed like friends who got together and were like, these are the stories we want to tell. These are the things we want to talk about in our community. And I think that that's so beautiful and powerful. And you can see that also in the fact that a lot of these web series don't live past a season or two because people have real jobs, people have other things to do. Your friend could probably hold you in your 20s to let you and your friends run around and make a web show for a couple of months. But after that, people move on. And I think that ephemeral nature is actually a positive because it kind of gives you a snapshot of this moment of what people in this community cared about at this time, and what people are looking for. And, a lot of us are looking for love. A lot of us are trying to figure out how relationships work. I mean, it's stories that are old, and also it matters for people to see versions of themselves. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about web series.
Yeah, particularly when the versions of yourselves are not something that you were seeing in the old media, right? Like if you were Black
Absolutely.
or if you're queer, if you had any kind of disability or a different kind of body. I mean, even to Issa Rae and being like an awkward Black girl, like, oh wait,
Absolutely.
yeah, all the Black women I've seen have been like super cool or they've been like the perfect wife or whatever. And like people started to realize like, oh, I haven't been seen. And when they were seen, they're like, I want to talk about this. Like, I want to talk about like who I am and find the other people who also relate to this. And then it did become about making money, which is something I saw in my book where I was like, when I started researching it, I was like, oh, why are people calling this TV? Because I know TV is this commercial thing, but this seems different. And then people started selling to Hollywood when Hollywood was interested in young voices and diverse voices. And then it became about that, which I've seen firsthand how it really does actually tear at community in really complicated ways. And so maybe we should talk about capitalism, but in general, like what has changed? Why are we in this moment where when you talk about social media, people kind of like stiffen up and they're like, oh God, no. What happened?
Yeah, I think you're right for us to shift to talking about capitalism. I mean, it really became clear that social media was catching things early. So social media was catching trends or even starting trends. And so capitalism is always going to find a way to get in there and, make things a little less desirable and less for the fun of it, the thrill of it. And so I've seen a real uh, move among people to monetize their content so that their ideas aren't stolen, so that they can make money off of their intellectual property. And in those early days, we weren't thinking like that. We were people having conversations with each other. And now social media has become a tool for people to make money. And some people have been successful. And I think it's kind of like basketball or something, It's like there are these dreams of becoming an influencer, becoming the kind of person who is using social media to make a life because some people have been able to do that successfully. And so just talking for the sake of talking, that has really shifted.
Yeah, it's something that happens kind of with every platform. Even like we were just saying, just talking for the sake of talking. That kind of maybe was TikTok, like when it started booming in 2020, when people were just home in the pandemic and just like venting because they were alone or whatever. And that's what made that platform popular. And then it became about, oh no, you need to set a trend. You need to hop on the trend. You need to use the right audio. You need to like work the algorithm in this way. And you know, what challenges does this environment bring up for people who want to create community, to want to tell stories, who want to use social media for non-commercial ends.
It's so interesting. I think I was telling you this before we started recording. Uh, I actually met a good friend, two good friends via Tumblr. Like met them on Tumblr, but then we became friends in real life and are friends to this day. And I think that's something that is so much harder to do now. I remember distinctly a video of two Tumblr friends meeting for the first time and them crying and embracing each other at the airport. That seems much harder to do now when people understand themselves to be speaking from a pulpit, to be speaking from a podium. That is not the kind of, I would say, circle that we had before. So that's one of the things that has me wondering, where do we go from here? How do we get back to those practices? And so, one of the things that I'm always thinking about is the digital helps, but also um, there are some analog things that we should remember, maintain. So, it's the both and always for me. And yeah, there's some limits to this digital moment. And I think one of the ways that we see that is the push to keep creating content, and that there's so much content. I mean, even AI generated content that people are not actually connecting to one another. And in relation to that AI content, one of the things I've been thinking through is the accessibility of all this. In some ways, AI has made it possible for people to caption, which is great, except AI captions are terrible. And people are not doing a second human pass of these captions. And they're just out in the world. And I just am thinking, I can't imagine trying to understand something based on captions, if that's what I have access to, and trying to make sense of it because it's the AI's assumption. And the AI misses so much in terms of context, especially for culturally specific reads of things. Those things get lost.
Yeah, it's always when you have someone who speaks with an accent or who use, Black American English, where those words that are actually the spiciest, best words get mistranslated by AI. And if you can't hear it, then you're literally missing some of the most important parts of what is said.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting to think about or be afraid of, like what happens when AI starts like audio describing things, like when you get that next level of multimodal and you're talking about people's faces and bodies, like that for me seems even scarier, to be honest. And I'm thinking about this connection between AI and algorithms and how those AI were they're probabilistic machines that are the same kinds of technologies that also organized people and their connections on these platforms and created that environment where people felt like they needed to shout to get through the AI, the AI algorithm, the algorithm that was sorting their content. I mean, you saw in your study of hashtag activism, like really organic connections were being created through hashtags, maybe in part because people were like following the hashtag. Right. They weren't relying necessarily on the algorithm to give them all their information. They were
That's right.
seeking it out. Um, and then it's shifted. I mean, people don't really use hashtags as much anymore. They rely
They
on
don't.
algorithms. We've really offloaded so much of our engagement to machines in so many ways. And now the machines are creating our engagement for us. Um, and so for me, I'm saying all that to say that when you said like we gotta go, the digital is good, but also we've got to go back to some analog practices. Do you see an opening for some other way of engaging that isn't machine driven?
Yes, I do. And I'm so excited about what some of the young people are doing now. Like there are young people who are playing games that are not online, like Luddite clubs where kids are playing board games and really embracing, no screens with our games. And then there's also people have been joking about cell phones in school and how people's phones are getting taken away and trying to bring back note passing. So I think there's hope for some of these things to come back and having more practice, having more ways that we can do that is important. I mean, one of the things that I wish for, and I've seen a couple of comedians talking about this too. There's a New York subway series, like What's Your Take? People talking to the Metro card. So I have a short story that I wrote about kind of my dream for an ethical internet. And in that, I imagine, internet quiet hours where people are not online. And in one of these, What's Your Take subway talks, somebody was saying, we just need a day where you can't access the internet. And I feel like those sentiments are very much in line. What would it mean for us to really take a break and say, actually, for the good of everyone, we're not going to do this for this amount of time? I think there's something powerful in that. The 24-hour, 24/7 cycle of news and information, I don't think that's how humans are supposed to make it work in the world. And I don't think it's working actually. So my sense is there's something to be said for paying attention to those circadian rhythms again and getting back to some sense of being in alignment with the rise and fall of the sun?
Hello, preach. I mean, I think you're right. And there have been studies, and I wish I had the citations offhand, but where they ask young people, like, do you want to get off social media? And they're like, no. But then they're like, but what if everyone got off social media? And they're like, hell yes. Like it's a thing where we all want it, but we're all afraid that we'll be left out because we are social beings and we need that. And so it is going to be incumbent upon platforms or policies, although, in this climate, maybe not, to help people do that, right? That's what governance is, right? Like there's something we all want, but there's a struggle around individual action. So we need to have a collective thing. There are some platforms, like I've heard that if you're in a WhatsApp group, the administrator of that group can shut down the chat whenever they want. And so there are some WhatsApp groups where they will shut it down at like 7, 8 p.m. so that nobody's getting updates at night so that you're just not worried about missing anything. You can actually be in your life at night when you're supposed to be resting and really, for the health of our bodies, not looking at your screen. Um, and I do think about this kind of refusal as important for getting people not only just back in their bodies, but like you're saying, kind of back with the people who are around them in their immediate physical environment, which I think in this moment is so necessary.
Absolutely.
People need to tap in to their local community. And there's something about social media that got people's perception of their community as like global, which was exciting in some ways, right? Like it's exciting to be part of a global community, but also it really eviscerated local media. It really, I think, eviscerated just connections between people in space. And I don't know, that's just my rant about how we've lost the local and the communal. But I think that we're being really forced right now to tap in a way that we haven't been. Have you been thinking about this just in this like, plutocracy, technocracy moment that we are just now in the beginning of? We're like 2 weeks into the technocracy.
Yes. So my latest book project is Woo for the World We Want. And part of it is thinking through what we need, what we want to hold as ritual, as practices within our local communities that get us back to the world we actually want to live in. And so much of that is about what we do on the local level and how we talk to each other. And something I say a lot, and I'm not the only one who says it, is that I don't know that we can do accountability at the level of nation state. I don't know that we can do accountability at the level of a city. I actually think that accountability comes in smaller pockets, like knowing your neighbors. Like I see those kinds of things as being really important. And even within that, that doesn't mean that we're not using technology. We're just using technologies in different ways. Going back to allied media, there's the organizations within allied media projects who have been working on uh, Ethernet networks within communities. So creating opportunities for people to share a server. So even if the internet goes down, uh, your community server that serves your building, however, might still be up. So you would be able to talk to the people in your building on your server, but you might not be able to talk to everyone in the world because the internet is down. And so thinking about those kind of mesh networks that people are creating that allow for a community to be connected to one another digitally, those are some of the things that I'm really excited about. And thinking through what do we actually want? How do we actually want to live? And starting to practice that and pay attention to that. I think this last election to me makes clear that the government is not going to save us if we're waiting on the Democrats or even the left in a lot of ways to do something. We're going to be waiting. So what does it mean for us to organize within our local community, and what kind of steps are we taking to make the kind of connections that will help us in whatever this next iteration of human existence is going to be?
Yeah, I love that mesh network example because it is using technology, but it's a technology that invites you to be where you are in space. And when we think about what we're heading towards, like what we've seen with the fires in LA, for instance, wouldn't that be a thing where if there's an emergency in your city, you immediately know, oh, I need to go to my mesh network and share networks, like share information amongst my network to get life-saving information because I know that there's not going to be some bigger body that can react as fast quickly on the ground and knows what's actually happening. People go to Twitter now, but you go to Twitter and you're just like sifting through muck and hate and trash to actually find information that's relevant to you. You're sifting through information from people who are 3,000 miles away who just have thoughts on what's happening in your place, right? And that's not going to work, especially in this era of climate change and all the other threats and disasters that await us,
You're
unfortunately.
so you're so right. You know, I was thinking about there was a story about a Black man who was a father whose son had a disability and he also had a disability, and they couldn't get out of their house in Altadena in time. And I just thought about that. Like, what would it be like if they weren't waiting on a fire department that's fighting fires everywhere? If their neighbors could know we need help getting out, as opposed to just neighbors leaving themselves, you know? Like it could have been such a different thing if the other neighbors who were evacuating knew that the people in this house are people who are going to need some support. So it's also that too, thinking through where we live and also doing the work of building those local connections so that when there is a crisis, which we can't predict, and yet also feels much more likely to occur in this era of time, that we've done some of the things to build the connections that help us keep each other safe.
Yeah, and it doesn't only have to be locally bounded. It can be bounded by other kinds of community networks. And I think that there's a way that you do want to be connected to people outside of your immediate physical location for all kinds of reasons. I might want a way to easily reach academics who study race, for instance, in this particular moment, and just kind of share quick information. And I'm on, some group chats or whatever where we've been sharing updates with what's going on politically, and that's been really useful and also very heartening to know that like you're not alone where you are. So I think the value of technology is that you can kind of layer your communities and tap in and out when you need to.
Absolutely.
It does require you to be more active, though. And we are in a period where people are very pressed for time and capacity because of capitalism and all the other isms. Um, so I'm curious, you don't have to tease your book in any way. If you've thought of, are there strategies that can help people bridge these technologies, to navigate these technologies? I've been using the word cultural protocols. Are there kind of rituals or things that can like help people navigate the way that they have to really be active members of multiple communities now?
Yes, I love this question. And so basically, what I'm thinking about with Woo for the World We Want is taking some of these esoteric arts that people don't really think matter and thinking about them in the context of the way we want to live our lives. And that also connects to how we use technology and the ways that we might reimagine it in the world that we actually want to live in. So, in addition to maybe having internet quiet hours, mesh networks, opportunities for people to connect in that way, I'm also thinking about some people who are designated interested in thinking through the infrastructure of these technologies so that we're not just relying on service provision from corporate entities, that we're not just relying on corporate entities to design the platforms that we use, because their interests are extractive and our interests aren't necessarily. So I want to think through, what does it mean to reorient our hobbies towards infrastructure, hobbies that actually help us sustain and also, keep us curious, keep us things where we want to do, but thinking about what we want to do in ways that help serve us and not end up serving uh, these larger corporate interests who really just want our money.
Yeah, I'm like, I have like all the fuzzies right now because when people talk about community infrastructure, it just gets me all excited. Because I'm just like, yes, that's what we need.
Is that what we need? Yes.
And I think you don't need billions of dollars to do that.
Yeah.
And we saw it last week with DeepSeek, although they did kind of have billions of dollars. But the way that these tech companies pretend like you need venture capital to create the technologies you need to survive is a fallacy, right? And it's a Ponzi scheme. It's a scam. We've done it before. You've already given us examples of community infrastructure. I like to use the example of radio, which has been a grassroots bootstraps technology for its entire existence, essentially, with the exception of the late 19th century colonial period where governments used it to, regulate their colonies. But after that, people would just build their own radio sets and just like broadcast like to their local community. It happened like in the projects, like in the 80s and 90s, like Black folks would just make their own radio sets, kind of like you said, creating their own mesh network, saying in this building, we have specific information that we need to share because the government is actively not looking out for us. An interesting story that the FCC like literally raided those radio stations because they didn't want people to actually own their own the means of the distribution of their own information. And so this is powerful, right? Like history tells us that like when people get together to create their own infrastructure, it like can rattle those in power, right?
Yes. I love that you mentioned radio, and I think that connects to a film we both love. Uh, it makes me think of, Born in Flames and kind of how there's this moment where feminists are thinking through what media is essential. Media is a crucial communications tool, and it's important that we have a stake in how it is used. And so much of us have ceded a lot of that in terms of how things work. And so that's why I get so excited about local radio stations and radio stations that are still trying to hold that space where we can do something and we can have a narrative that's outside of one note and one distributor's agenda.
Yeah, and just for we can nerd out on the radio for just one more second because I'm here in Chicago, that's where you live as well, and our one of our community radio stations, Vocalo, was threatened a few years ago, and it was going to shut down, and people were alarmed. I mean, it's the only radio station I basically listen to in the city of Chicago, and one of the beautiful things about it is that in between songs they don't have ads, but they have like local activists, organizers, community healers just talk about why they love Chicago in between songs. And it's such a counterpoint to the narrative about Chicago, not only outside of Chicago and national media, but also local media that really perpetuates this narrative that Chicago is just a city of like violence and crime when there's so many beautiful things about this city. In addition to like highlighting like local artists, Vocalo was just a place for us to feel proud to be here, which is like really critical when you live in a city to walk around not in fear but in love is like kind of everything actually when you think about it. um so I think that what you're saying is kind of we need to bring that attitude to the digital, and it seems like young people at least are ready. It seems like maybe millennials, we're kind of like we've seen this develop, so we know what we're trying to go back to when early like chat rooms before Twitter, Tumblr, early Tumblr, right, was lit. Um, I think maybe the folks in power right now, they don't get it. They're the older folks, they just use social media in the broadcasting way that they understand media in the 20th century. And it's it's not the way. It's just not the way. My final two questions, I think you've already answered, but I want to pose them to you just in case you want to reiterate some points or say something new, which is, what is if we could save anything about the current platforms that we use, what is one thing, if there was even just a tweak we could make to make them just a little bit less harmful, is there something we can do? I think you mentioned quiet hours, which I think is great and would kind of be universally loved, um, though not profitable. So that's why it's not going to happen probably. And and or um, what is um, one thing that you currently love still about the platforms? Like, is there still things that you do get from the major platforms that most people use?
Yes. So I love memes. I am a millennial meme girl. So I love the memes of people also questioning this moment. And what I love is the different levels that they have to hit on. So, people are referencing a TV show, and that TV show might be referencing something else that's older than it, and it might be referencing a song. So I really love those stacked, complicated memes. That is something I still love, want forever. I will always, even as I critique Instagram, I am still there because of those things. And I would say the one thing that I would love to get rid of is ads and advertising in general. And so that also, I think, maybe means even getting rid of brand accounts and accounts that are not people. I think that's, and I say this with the caution because I do really love how, Mount Everest and some of these other entities were getting in on Twitter and having lots of critiques about national policy. But the people who were running those seemed to be real people, and it wasn't um, they weren't selling anything. They were participating in a conversation and thinking about these important parts of the world as having their own stake and need to be in a conversation about the environment, how we're moving as a planet, etc. So yeah, I think those are kind of the big things that are on my mind.
I love that. That's so generative. I love the focus on like brand accounts because what would it mean if once you reach a certain threshold of followers, the platform assumes that no one person could possibly serve all those people, right? Like, so not even just corporate brands, but also like Kim Kardashian or Ariana, where it's like they're not on there engaging with community. They have a staff to do it. And maybe that's just like a separate feed. And you can go there for that if you want. And the brands that truly do engage will get people to go to that feed for them. But if you're just
Yes.
broadcasting, like, get off my feed and like let me engage with the people who are actually engaging for real, like that would be transformative. And it would still allow space for, like you said, like conscious brands or even local brands that don't have lots of followers but do need to like share information locally to still participate in some way. I think that's a brilliant idea. And yes to memes. I have like a little paragraph in my book on like examples of reparative media. And I talk about Adrienne Marie Brown's account and Cyrus Ware's account. And like, these are activists who are like, I'm not a brand. Like, I'm not about like pushing out me here. I'm just literally about sharing things that others are creating that can like help us just survive what all is going on, which is a lot. And they're so healing. You go on there and you're like, oh, this is funny. I've laughed. I feel seen. I don't feel like I'm the only one. I don't feel alone. And I definitely will still go to social media just for that, a little bit of joy.
A little bit of joy, like little pockets of respite is how I've talked about it. Like little just moments where you can rest a little bit and have a laugh in the midst of all of it.
Indeed. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, insights, and experience. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure for me too.